It's my great pleasure today, the 12th of September 1985, to welcome to Bracknell Air Chief Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst. Sir Harry has been in the thick of it for much of his career. He first saw active service in India in 1931, and during the early stages of World War II, he commanded RAF Hornchurch, a station that played a prominent part in the Battle of Britain. After a short while at 11 Group, Sir Harry went out to the Desert Air Force as Sasso in the rank of Air Commodore, and in January 1943 he took command, the youngest Air Vice-Marshal in the Royal Air Force, and in that capacity he was very much Montgomery's right-hand man. Later in the war he commanded 83 Group of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, a group that played an important part in the Normandy invasion. After the war, Sir Harry filled numerous important posts, culminating firstly in his appointment as CNC of the 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force in Germany, secondly as CNC Bomber Command, and lastly as CNC Allied Air Forces Central Europe. It was a distinguished career, and we're therefore delighted that Sir Harry has taken the time to come to Bracknell today to talk about one or two problems of contemporary interest. Well, sir, for this first session, I thought what I'd like to do is take as our theme the air-land battle, because it seems to me that many would argue that you are perhaps the father, if you like, of the tactical Air Force operations. And I just wondered, when you first developed your views about air-land cooperation, was that very much during the retreat through France in 1940?
I had more an affinity with the Army than many because my father, my grandfathers, my close cousins were in the Army. I had a short period in the Army before I transferred to the Air Force. And my first contact was in India, where of course the Air Force was virtually used to support Army operations.
Yes.
At Rizalpur, we lived in a cantonment which were 2 cavalry regiments, and all the social and sporting life was a mixture of Army Air.
Yes.
Playing games, squash, everything was associated. And so I got to know them very well and their problems. And then when I went to 111 Squadron in 1939 after Staff College, where, as a matter of interest, the commandant was Air Marshal Barrett, and one of the students was Colonel Withdrawal. Now, after Staff College, the AFDU, where we had to assess, or help to assess, all the new aircraft coming into the RAF, of which the Lysander was one. And I remember in my report I ridiculed the Lysander with its one-back gun, slow speed, biplane and all this. I said, you know, if anybody thinks that's going to stand up to a 109, you've got another thing coming through. And then in May 40, I did a short posting to France, where I met the squadron commander of the Lysander squadron.
Oh, really?
Retreating with the rest of the setup. And he had no Lysanders left. The whole lot had been shot down. Every one of them. I also saw the Germans in action with their Stukas, which were equally vulnerable.
Yes.
But the Germans had complete air superiority. On the other hand, any close association with my setup and the army around me was nil, except insofar they were retreating past me.
No cooperation at all?
None. And no information about what they were trying to do. And so when I came back to England, as far as I was concerned, the whole thing was pathetic.
And it was that then set you thinking about how one might more sensibly tackle the problem.
Yes, it struck me as being rather ludicrous the way we're going to run Army air like that, and then we had another thing coming. Of course, our own troops and the French and the civilians, for that matter, were terrified of these Stukas coming right down low level.
Yes.
And not only dropping bombs, but they put screechers on, so that the terrifying noise and low level. All these things made an impression on me, I suppose. Well then, after a period in fighters, I was taken off flying in 42 when Beamish was killed. There was a tendency to bring the experienced survivors out of flying. And I went as Deputy SASO to 11 Group in time for Dieppe, where until then I had been called Broady by my AOC. By the time we'd finished the planning for Dieppe, I was Broadhurst. In other words, we had publicly we had disagreements about the way we
fallen out somewhat.
That's right. So on the day of Dieppe, I took it upon myself to borrow from Hornchurch, a Spit 9, and cruised around watching the proceedings. We'd instituted control ships with airmen on board, and the naval people directing the gunfire, and the airmen directing the Air Force. One thing I objected to was that old Lee Mallory was a bit sort of wing mad as a result of influence by Barder.
Yes.
And I reckon wings had their place in life, but you just didn't use wings for every job.
It was just too unmanageable, was it? Too large a formation?
Too inflexible.
Too inflexible.
But it was a method of concentrating in time and space.
Right.
So I went over in the early morning at a reasonably safe height, and just a bit of Broadhurst luck. I came across half a dozen 190s with bombs on, screeching down through the circus underneath, bombing the ships, then roaring off inland to France. So I landed back, I think it was either Biggin Hill or Kenley, and rang up the ops room at 11 Group and told them what was happening. I've got a fellow called Willoughby de Brook, who was the head controller there. So they diverted a squadron of Spitfires to the same height and up sun, same place that I'd gone, and ran into a half a dozen 190s.
Really? And knocked them out?
Knocked the whole bloody lot out, yes. So by the time I got back in the evening, I was Broady again. But it's like all these things in life, you want a bit of luck.
Yes.
And so I wrote a report on the whole thing and then forgot about it. Then in the summer, just again luck. Instead of Lee Mallory giving a lecture to the newly formed Army Corps Command, he sent me. And who should I be sitting next to for lunch but Barrett, who would be my commandant at the Staff College.
At Andover, yes.
At Andover. Woodall was there as a brigadier. And they had both been in France, Barrett commanding the setup that I was involved in, and Montgomery,
Oh, really?
who'd gone there for a bit of a talk before going out to Alamein. So having given my rather clapped out lecture, in which he cross-examined me about actually the invasion, more than Army Corps, I went back, but from them I had learnt that Woodall, and with the sympathy of Barrett, and Woodall had been in Staff College, and another chap called Oxtra, and an airman called Wong, Group Captain Wong, I never met. were all busy analysing France and Dieppe and arriving at new methods of making sure of Army air support. So that gave me something to think about. That was in August. In September I was posted to the desert. Now, what genius had been at work, I don't know, but I didn't want to leave fighter command. So I arrived out of the desert where the new setup had just been installed.
Along the lines that have been developed in the Army Cooperation...
That's right.
Right.
The Woodall, one Woodall system,
Yes.
which consisted of ALOs at squadrons, ASUs as they later became, or tentacles, down to sort of brigade level, with direct contact back to corps division. Well, the divisions are all on the same frequency, and back to corps,
Yes.
and corps to army, which was alongside the Air Force. So you had a complete integration of information. So when I got there, this was set up, so I can't be in any way regarded as the father of it.
But nevertheless, you made it work then.
Well, the difficulty was that we virtually got complete air superiority. And the old boys, if I can call them that, like Bomber Harrison's bombers, had been brought up. The essential was to get air superiority first. And the whole of the efforts of the Desert Air Force at that time was devoted to getting air superiority, and quite rightly. The trouble is what to do with it when you've got it. How do you recognise when you've got it? So Monty won the Battle of Alamein, assisted nobly by the Air Force, and then started to advance up the desert. And this is where the trouble started. Tedder and Cunningham were highly critical of the slow way he followed up his success, rather overlooking what they could have been doing to assist him, in my opinion. We were still putting up a dozen light bombers with a huge fighter escort. Whereas my inclination was to go ahead of the rear of the retreating armies and block the road, because basically their main route was along the coast road. Places like the Saloon Pass were ideal, I would have thought. So I came into conflict with my boss, almost in the word go, and I'd been warned by Basil Embry that I would. He'd been out there and been sacked.
And your boss in this case being Cunningham?
Yes.
Yes.
Meanwhile, Cunningham, I think, was a very jealous, irrational sort of chap. Monty had got all the credit. Every newspaper, the church bells were ringing, everything was the victory at Alamein.
He was very good at the publicity, wasn't he?
Yes, but equally the whole place. I mean, Churchill had got a victory.
Yes.
After all, we'd had our time with the Battle of Britain, which was a great victory and was publicised and republicised and exaggerated to a great extent. And the same at Alamein, they were thirsting for a victory. But of course the Air Force hardly came into it. So I think Cunningham was very jealous about this. Meanwhile, they were both very critical of the slowness with which Monty followed up his success. But of course Rommel was falling back on his supplies, and we were moving away from us.
Right.
That was one difficulty. Another difficulty was that it poured as rain, and it actually blew dust at the same time. I've never seen it happen before. And getting off the road was pretty tricky. So to envelop the retreating army, you had to get into the desert
And swing round.
Right. Plus the fact that Monty was equipped with quite a few old generals who were very good at playing polo in India before the war,
Yes.
and had great influence at White's Club in Whitehall. So he couldn't easily just sack generals who were a bit slow, not understanding armour the way Rommel understood it.
Mm.
So the atmosphere became very unpleasant. And then when we reached Tripoli, Tedder had been sent to North Africa, and Sholto Douglas had come from Fighter Command, Middle East. Cunningham went home, and then back to North Africa again with Tedder, where he gave a press conference in the Dorchester Hotel or somewhere, and ran down Monty in the 8th Army, which of course we didn't know about till the newspapers came out.
Presumably it didn't go down very well in Britain either, did it?
Well, of course it was very unpopular.
Yeah.
The army just never forgave him, which is a pity because he was, he had a very good appreciation of land-air battle.
Mm.
But he never adapted below or improved the organisation that he had set up for Alamein. Anyway, he went to North Africa, and I suddenly found myself as an AVM.
It was after only, 3 or 4 months in the theatre, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, when we got to Tripoli, there was a long pause because we'd run out of our supplies.
Mm.
And of course, if the Germans had had anything of an air force left, we were terribly vulnerable.
Mm.
But by then, they having overwhelmed us in France, we were now overwhelming them in the desert. But going up the desert road, Freddie de Gangon, who was Chief of Staff to Monty,
Yes.
had pulled my leg about all these lorries which we said we destroyed, which didn't appear to be there anymore. And I'd flown up in my Storch, captured Storch, and I had to agree that there weren't many lorries there, really. I didn't tell him I'd already had a row with my boss over it. But we taught these chaps air-to-air firing. We never taught them
Air to ground at all.
air-to-ground. Oddly enough, in 1936, was the first time we started air-to-air firing training. Before that, we always did air-to-ground. Anyway, you couldn't blame the chaps.
Mm.
They hadn't been educated that way. B, they had a reluctance to go low.
Why? Because of all the small arms fire?
That's right. Well, yes, but of course in a retreat that's pretty negligible. Most people are out to save their own necks rather than form a defensive.
Mm.
Anyway, when we got to Tripoli, I found myself in charge of this lot, having my leg pulled by de Gangon. So I got them to set up a typical German army column. Tanks, armoured cars, captured stuff. And we put the ASUs in.
Mm.
And I also had chaps in armoured cars, squadron leaders.
Right.
I said, now, come on, we'll knock this lot out. So we called them up as if it was war and put them into attack. I also had anti-tank Hurricane squadron and let them see what they could hit and what they couldn't hit. And being fighter pilots, they learned very quickly. So when we started, we couldn't hit them standing still. The time we'd finished, they could hit them moving. So I was lucky that I had that bit of training.
It was just in the breathing space
At Tripoli.
at Tripoli, yes.
Unfortunately, again, I handed over the air defence to the Middle East.
Mm.
A fellow called Barry Heath came up. Was it? No. Grandy. John Grandy came up, and he was responsible for the air defence of the rear areas. Just as a few sergeant pilots from the German Air Force came over at low level and bombed the ships in the harbour. And he said, you so-and-so, you know. And I just handed the responsibility over. I may say, having previously warned both the Admiral and Monty that the concentration of ships in the harbour was absolutely asking for trouble. But they couldn't go outside because of the submarines. However, bit of luck. So off we go for the next big battle, was the Mareth Line, which the left flank was the sea, the right flank were the Marta Mountains. And beyond that was desert, with a lot of what they call sea sands, very, very soft sands which had been reckoned to be impossible to pass. So the plan for the Mareth battle was to attack the Mareth Line, which the French had built, which had concrete pillboxes and you name it, with an assault over a dry wadi. Well, as the time arrived, the low, misty, foggy, drizzle weather arrived, and I said to Monty, we won't be able to operate with any efficiency, we won't find the targets in this weather, it's just not on. And he made the decision to go ahead without us. Not a bad bit of luck for a very highly promoted junior officer, because he got the biggest punch on the nose he'd ever had. And at about 3:30 in the morning I was rung up for a meeting with all the generals to pull back from the Mareth Line and devise a new plan. As a matter of interest, Churchill came out to stay because his son, who was in the Guards, was killed in that battle.
Oh, really?
So he came to stay. So the new plan was to outflank the Mareth Line by going through this desert, which was reconnoitred, had been reconnoitred by the what they call the long-range desert group, famous bunch of chaps who operated behind the enemy lines, and they reckoned they could guide or mark a track, but they would need bridges occasionally to get over these sand rivers or seas. And we devised very, very close support with the Chaps, the fighter bombers. And by then I had two groups of American fighters and Warhawks with their .5 machine guns and a good bomb load, long range, better than the Kitty Hawks.
Right.
And also two groups of B-25s. I think I'm the only chap who's ever commanded any Americans. And so the great day arrived when this battle was to take place. Meanwhile, Cunningham was sending me signals, Tedder was sending me signals, and eventually Air Commodore Beamish, the Beamish's brother, was sent round by air, couldn't tell me what a bloody fool I was. They'd got the plan from the army, had sent it to Alexander, who was Commander-in-Chief on the North African side. And it hadn't occurred to me to send my air plan because I was still under Middle East Sholto Douglas. And so as soon as the army got the plan, it was passed to the Tedder, who was Commander-in-Chief Air, and the horror.
Well, there appeared to be no air plan at all.
No, they didn't want the Air Force going in close support of the army.
No, he didn't.
At low level. So I sweated my guts out that night. It looked like being a squadron leader again. And I decided to go around all the squadrons the next day and tell them why we were doing what we were doing. To go right down on the deck. It's the only way of avoiding being shot down and the only way of identifying what they were shooting at. And what we wanted to get at was all the opposing armies, headquarters vehicles, signals and so on and so forth. Which they succeeded in knocking out. The whole thing was a tremendous success, and no one sent me any signals of congratulation.
No, that never happens, does it? Or rarely, anyway.
Meanwhile, we captured thousands of Germans, amongst them the general, Italian general commanding this lot. And he said he was blind and deaf. All his signals were gone.
He didn't know what was going on.
What the hell was happening? And, of course, we had practiced this RAF chaps in armoured cars, and wherever there was any resistance, usually an anti-tank screen,
they were able to call up air support pretty quickly.
Knock them out.
Yep.
Because in the desert, you could see everybody.
Yes.
The question was to identify them, because they all look the same in the air. And so the armoured cars and their controllers came into their own, and we had a success. That was virtually the end of the Desert Air Force's big battles, because after a few minor engagements we joined up with the other people, North Africans, and came to a halt at a place called Hammamet.
And presumably after that the next major campaign was the capture of Tunis, was it?
Well, there's an interesting story there. I got a message, would I pick up General Alexander at Monastir Airfield, one of our main airfields, and take him up to Monty's TAC headquarters, which was right up, as usual, in the front line. So I picked up Alexander and we went up there for breakfast. And then, after a lot of gossip over breakfast, we went to the map room. And it transpired he wanted to borrow a commander from Monty and some divisions for this final assault on Tunis. So Monty asked him what his plan was. And his plan was to attack on the whole front, which was definitely an anti-Monty way of running a battle. So Monty said, well, I think you're being stupid. Why not choose...
As frank as that, was he?
Yes,
As ever.
absolutely.
Yes.
Why not choose the best area for attack? We've got the Germans pinned down, they can't move reserves, they haven't got much fuel. And then go straight for them with all the air and all the tanks and everything you've got. I reckon you'll be marching through Tunis in 48 hours. Actually, it was just under 48 hours. So then Jorrocks, who he'd given to him to command this setup, came to see me, having been involved in this outflanking movement, and said, now then, what are we going to do for this Battle of Tunis? I said, well, I'm afraid you're now under another air force. But this is what I would suggest you do. Go and see a chum of mine over there who I'm sure will fall in with whatever you want to do. So that was the end of it. But one interesting thing happened. We were really having very little to do except bombing airfields and so on to help the other people. But on Ultra, which I got every morning, we realized that they were sending huge columns of transports from Sicily, making landfall at Cape Bon. And on our rather primitive radar, we were getting plots high up, which when intercepted proved to be 109s, and we lost some very good chaps in these battles. And putting two and two together, I reckon that somewhere down right below were the transports.
Virtually on the deck.
Yes. Well, after one or two disappointments, bearing in mind we were working at maximum range, short of fuel, and to bring off an interception, which you only knew about when you got the plots of the fighters, and then they had to be fairly close by the time you got them. You had to be lucky. Anyway, after one or two disappointments, I again went round and saw all the pilots and said, look, you're bloody well not going down on the deck, are you? That's where I reckon that I'd be if I was creeping across the Mediterranean. And I was actually with a conference with Mary Cunningham on the other side when a message came in, and he said to me, "What are you doing in our area?" Bearing in mind he's commanding the Tactical Air Force, it was his area, so I said, "Well, nothing in particular, we're trying to catch these transports." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, there's an alert gone out for air-sea rescue by the Germans." When I got back, I found they'd run into these things and slaughtered them.
Really?
No escort down there.
Nice.
And they were full of petrol, ammunition, you can imagine. So that was a nice diversion from the ordinary army, I suppose.
Yes. And then Tunis was, of course, a great success in the end, wasn't it?
Oh, they were through in 48 hours.
In that time.
Then after a bit of relaxation, we had actually I was in England, we were recalled for a conference with the President, the Prime Minister, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, for the invasion of Sicily. Where again, Monty was designated the army commander for the actual invasion, and he disagreed with the plan completely, which was that the Americans would attack at the Catania end, at the Palermo end, and the British would attack at the Catania end. He said, "You are splitting our forces. The Germans have internal lines, and they'll punch one lot on the nose and then go and punch the other lot on the nose. I insist that we go together." With that, he went off to a memorial service in Cairo for his chaps at Demain and left them to get on with it. So after a lot of argument, they all gave way and the Americans agreed. This is a joint plan from the joint planners. And so then I was moved to Malta, and Monty was moved to Malta for the actual invasion. You asked me questions about that. AOC Malta controlled the air for the actual invasion.
Yes.
As indeed 11 Group did for the actual invasion of Europe. And when I landed and got airfields, the control passed to me, and Malta ceased to have any operational control. There was a slight disagreement because my lot was supposed to put all their transport and etc. on landing craft, and they borrowed Malta's transport to keep them going while the loading was going on. In fact, they loaded all the nice new transport from Malta and left behind their old desert transport for the AOC Malta. And he sent me a signal, wouldn't believe it, demanded it back.
From Sicily.
And all the nice forks and spoons and nice new pots and pans, they all went to.
What about the concept of operations in Sicily? Did that vary very much? Did that differ very much from what you'd been used to in the North African campaigns?
Well, one major reorganisation happened, and that was the tactical bomber forces were put under one control, called the tactical bomber force. So that all the chaps we'd had following us up the desert, who knew the army, knew us, knew the fighter pilots,
were now split off and put into a separate...
Yes. And that, although efficient in one way or another, we lost the immediate tactical call on bombers. And they were used for basically knocking out airfields and LFC and so on by the headquarters in North Africa. Another disadvantage was that the Desert Air Force and the 8th Army were in Malta, and the Americans were still in Tunis and Algiers, with a further force coming from England. So, anyway, another difficulty was, after getting into Sicily, of course the ground was different. Rocky, mountainous, a lot of green country, narrow valleys and so on, which we were not used to. We were used to flat desert.
Wide open spaces in the sense.
Right. Yes. We also had a fair number of new divisions, who didn't understand the techniques. So we modified our methods of identification, partly because we had good maps now, and we gridded the maps to narrow down the point. I had one big upset with a fellow called General Dempsey, who later commanded 2nd Army, and I was his airman for the invasion. He came in with a new corps, and they called for a bit of close support, which we gave them. But in the period of getting the support, this is before the cab rank.
Right.
Before getting the support, the Germans pulled out and they advanced into the target. So there was a hell of a row because we bombed
our own troops. Is that partly because you'd gone away from your concept of having airmen in armoured cars that you were talking about in the North African campaigns?
No,
had that disappeared?
It just was that the new setup didn't bother to tell us that they'd changed their mind. So my lot advanced with them, but we bombed a specific target, not an isolated. You see, the concept of having forward controllers was that you could use your squadron leader to talk to them in their own language and put them onto a specific target, like an anti-tank screen,
right. Yes.
or some armoured cars, or armour. When you came to an ordinary sort of a blockage of village or something of that nature, or hidden troops,
then you just go on a grid reference to...
and bomb it.
And bomb it, yes.
So he moaned to the army. I looked into it and found that they disobeyed a cardinal rule. So I said to Monty, getting a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? So he hauled Dempsey up. And it's the first time I've ever seen a general get a rocket from a general. He really tore him apart.
Really?
So Dempsey didn't like me very much. Little did we know we were going to be...
hand in glove a year or so later, yes.
But it was an example of a breakdown in the system when you get a new lot of chaps. The ALOs were inexperienced. The whole system was inexperienced. Yes. And they'd gone back to 1940.
So it again took a few months before people got
So back came the armoured cars and tanks and forward control with the troops.
Right.
And of course the emphasis of a bomb line and sticking to it. See, unless the ALOs were told by the tentacles forward that the troops had advanced, you wouldn't necessarily know in your armoured car that they had done.
Right.
So this then had to be reinforced with more armoured cars, more RAF controllers and so on. Well, then we got to the end of the Sicilian campaign. Am I going on too long?
No, that's fine, sir. And then you got across onto the mainland.
Well, the big disappointment was that we couldn't stop the army, German army, getting away with their heavy equipment across.
Yes, I think 100,000 got across, didn't they? It was an enormous
with
number.
all their heavy equipment. Now I put in for, which I had to, for bombers, because they put all their flak and their anti-tank guns, which would also around the ports, and it was absolute murder to put the 5 bombers in. So I called for heavy bombers and got no reply. I actually put it in writing. Somebody uncovered this the other day, which reminded me of it. They'd found the letter in the official records.
Really?
Then, of course, the whole emphasis was switched to the Americans and Salerno. And the 8th Army and the Desert Air Force were left really with not much to do. So Monty got across the straits, unopposed. The army that had gone across had nipped off up to the Salerno area. And I scrounged a few transport aircraft from Sholto Douglas down in Cairo and got my lot over with their little mini radars and things. And we hurried round the toe and the heel and up to Foggia.
And again, using the same sort of techniques as you've been doing before.
Yes, but very little opposition.
But little opposition.
Very little. You couldn't say that we were achieving much except to keep air superiority.
Right.
Which is essential. But we had one event in crossing the Trigno River, I think it was the Trigno River. And Monty got overconfident again. He put the tanks over before he put the anti-tank screen over. I was away out with a squadron somewhere, and he rang me up and said, "We're in a muddle, we've been counterattacked, and it looks like disaster. Can you bring your chaps in?" Like a fool, perhaps, I rang up the wing leaders of the fighter bomber setup and told them it was an emergency. And would they do their best to unscramble it? And lost in the process one of my best chaps, who went into a tank, bombs and all, rather like the Japanese.
Kamikaze
But yes, if I hadn't rung them up, I'd left it the ordinary system, I probably wouldn't have had such heavy losses.
But it worked, did it?
It worked. I brought them to a grinding halt.
Right.
But they had to come out in the open.
Yes.
And the trouble with all these operations, I'll relate later in Normandy, was if they hid up in wooded country and so on, you couldn't get at them. And with the anti-tank screens hidden in hedges and ditches and so on, dug in, there's not much anybody could do about it.
And indeed our advance up Italy subsequently was actually quite slow, wasn't it?
Very. And then of course winter came and that was the end of it. Meanwhile the other side tried to do a battle in the winter with enormous losses. If Monty had been in command, I think that would not have happened.
Right. And then you came back to Britain
Well then
at that stage, during that winter.
Tedder, Monty and Cunningham went home. And Slessor came out. And he had me up and said, "Now you're the one chap who isn't going home." Typical remark. And I was quite pleased. I was fed up with these prima donnas by then, say nothing of all the Americans as well. And I was looking forward to a battle up
Italy.
Italy and Austria and so on. I won't relate in detail what happened, but I went home.
And that's when you were put in charge of number 83 group.
And relieved Dickie Dixon.
Right.
Later to become Chief of the Air Staff and Chief of Defence Staff.
Yes, quite.
And my Sasso was Dermot Boyle, who also became Chief of the Air Staff.
And then you had what, sort of getting on for 6 months preparing?
No, I wasn't in the command till March, April.
Oh, I see. So you only had 3 or 4 months.
I had a short time, very embarrassing, to have taken over from a very popular senior chap.
Yes.
To get to know the wings and the groups and so on, and change the organisation from a typical fighter command setup to what I had learnt in the desert.
Yes. So that was a deliberate, conscious policy on your
That's
on
right,
your part.
which Lee Mallory resisted.
Did he?
He wanted it the way he designed it as a second tactical air force, you see. Meanwhile, Cunningham, of course, was there. He wanted it to go back to desert, which is the ability to leapfrog and advance quickly or retreat quickly while maintaining your aircraft in the air. So we did that major reorganisation before the invasion, which was then controlled by 11 Group. Until we landed and got enough airfields.
Because you were across fairly quickly, weren't you, after the...
I went over the second day, yes.
Yes. And your headquarters followed pretty...
Oh yes. We had it set up with Second Army and, of course, Monty's TAC headquarters. He would never hang about the back areas. So we had Monty, Dempsey, Broadhurst. And as the squadrons fed in, we had Canadian Army and 84 Group without the headquarters. So we were a pretty massive setup until we expanded enough to fit in their headquarters.
Mm.
And the air defence system came under 84 Group, later 85 Group.
Mm.
Well, the problem in Normandy, this is part of the question you asked me, was this dense bocage country.
Yes. Terribly difficult to fight in for the ground troops, I think.
Very difficult if you got a determined defensive force.
Yes.
If they came out in the open and did a counterattack, then you had them.
Mm. But tucked into these deep little narrow lanes.
That's right. Well, an amusing story was that I used my Storch to go round the wings, visiting, and I could land on almost anything and take off from it. But the 7th Armour Division headquarters was in this bocage country.
Mm.
So when I went to visit the Bobby Erskine, the general,
Yes.
I went by jeep. And my driver was Rees, the famous golfer.
Oh, really?
So we were herring along in the jeep, which I hated because you got tangled up with all the administrative petrol stuff going over.
Yes.
Disappeared into this bocage country where the troops were all along lining the ditches. I thought they were waving at me. We went belting along this road until we came to a crossroads, and on each side was a Tiger tank.
You'd run straight into the Germans.
So,
You rapidly retreated.
which I'm really telling you is a bit amusing. All this pompous Air Marshal. And just shows you how they were hidden.
Yes.
I couldn't even see them from a jeep till I was actually...
Virtually on top of them.
And these guns came swinging round, and Rees, I've never gone backwards so fast in all my life. He didn't turn around. He just went into reverse, and we roared back. The troops by then, of course...
Scattered into the...
They got the humour of the situation. Cheering this intrepid Air Marshal going backwards.
Yes. But you eventually found the headquarters.
I got to... by which time Bobby Erskine had said, hello, hello. He said, you got ahead of my forward troops for a bit. But it shows the difficulty.
Yes. But how else did the terrain affect your methods of operation there, in terms of the air cooperation?
Well, we had chaps in tanks.
Mm.
So on occasions, there were moments when we could use this. I then had all these rocket typhoons.
Yes.
But basically, we were on interdiction. Bomber Command were flying a deceptive radar,
Yes.
trying to make it all look as if the main force was going to land at Calais,
Yes.
which was the obvious place.
Yes.
So the Germans had 2 armour divisions held up.
Right up in the north.
Right up in the north. And the deception, there was a lot of deception going on. The rest were busy making sure that those divisions would have great difficulty in reinforcing when they discovered what they were up against, by knocking out bridges, railways.
So you were actually rather further behind the lines than you had been in Italy and Sicily and the desert before.
Interdiction was the order of the day, and all the tactical bombers ditto.
Yes.
And then we had a break when, on Ultra, Hitler ordered the armoured forces in front of us, the Panzers, to cut Patton's line of communication, where he rather dangerously stuck his neck out and roared down at a place called Mortain. And at all costs, these Panzers are ordered to cut him off. So I thought, well, now there'd be a chance coming up, because we had all the rockets. Americans had no anti-tank airborne stuff. And sure enough, the RAF liaison officer, I believe, has just written a book, forgotten his name, fighter pilot, who was liaison with the American forces, came over to see me and said, look, can you have a go at these Panzers? And of course there they were out in the open. no lager of 88mm guns round them.
No. And you had air superiority. They were sitting down.
Soft touch. An interesting point about this was, long after it was at the IDC, in the days when it was an IDC, we had an American colonel there who used to drink whiskey at every possible opportunity. And I walk into the anteroom one day, and there he is at the bar, and nobody else there. It was about 6 months after the IDC had started. And I went up to the bar for a drink. He said, "Your name's Broadhurst, isn't it?" Well, as we've been there for 6 months.
He ought to have known.
I was a bit surprised. He said, "You own those rocket typhoons, didn't you?" In Normandy. I said, "Yes, matter of fact, I did." "Well," he said, "they certainly saved my bacon," he said. And he had an infantry division facing this lot. When my lot came over and started knocking his tanks out. And so first time I got an American view of what happened. I said, "Well, you know, these technical guys after the war proved conclusively that we couldn't knock tanks out. The bombs really never did any damage, and neither did rockets. So you didn't have to do much damage," he said. "The buggers were getting out of their tanks and running away."
Is that right? Yes. Hordes of typhoons coming up.
That's right. And you put one on fire, and it's morale in any service. If you can't hit back,
Yes.
you don't like it. If you can fight back on reasonable terms, the chaps will be very brave. But if you can't answer back, and they had no attack defence, you see.
Yes.
Anyway, that was the first opportunity. And the second opportunity was, of course, the Yanks then started an encircling movement. And we got the first rumours of the Germans retreating. And in both cases, I did an almost unheard of thing. Instead of sending over big formations with air defence attached, escorts, I told them to go in pairs or fours and just go on slaughtering as hard as they could go. In other words, a quick turnaround. When they came back, instead of having to rearm a squadron, they only had a couple of aircraft to rearm.
So, yes, so it was a continuous process.
Right. In both cases. And I think it paid off. The chaps thought it did anyway. And we had a standing patrol over the top as general defence.
Yes. So this was really the start of your cab rank system then, was it, effectively?
No, we got the cab rank system going in Italy, Sicily, Italy.
Had you?
But not refined it to tanks.
Right.
Normandy, we got into tanks. And we'd rehearsed everything for this advance. Everything was designed that one day we would advance. Nobody thought it would take quite so long. And once again, they were blaming Monty.
Yes.
Yeah. Great plots going on to get rid of him and so on and so forth, which I don't think the British public would have stood for. He's far too popular with the troops. Anyway, when the advance started, I had my chaps right up front in tanks. They didn't like it very much.
They joined the Air Force to fly after.
I met one, a drunken auxiliary who died the other day, actually. He sent me a tape of what he thought of me.
Really? Was it repeatable?
He saw the sense of it.
Yes.
But he didn't like being in a tank and being shot at.
Yes, he'd rather someone else did that.
Rather be flying. But it worked. And Falaise, I felt sick when I went to look at it. I mean, I couldn't believe I'd be involved in such a horrific destruction. And of course, panic set in. The tanks were climbing over the infantry and over the horses and carts they'd commandeered and so on. You've never seen anything like it. So that was the end of the Normandy campaign. Thereafter,
you then stayed with 83 Group, I think, didn't you? Until until the end of the war.
Yes, and 84 did a much slower advance because their job was to get these ports like Le Havre and so on which the Germans defended to the last inch,
Yes.
because they deprived us fuel and ammunition.
Yes, we didn't really get a major port for a long time, did we?
Until Antwerp.
Until Antwerp, really, yes.
And that took a long while. So we came to a grinding halt in Belgium, where we had a new role, dropping food into the Dutch.
Yes.
So, what else happened?
But in terms of the land-air cooperation, it was very much the same as you'd been perfecting in Normandy.
Once they started to retreat,
we
had a target.
Yes.
Now, at Falaise, and on later occasions, I did what I would like to have done in the desert. I didn't attack the nearest troops, but went for the leading troops in the retreat. Tried to block the roads. And one saw the result at Falaise. It was very interesting.
Well, we captured enormous numbers there, didn't we?
That's right. And
perhaps not as many as we should have done, but...
They came up against these these chock roads, but the tanks were climbing over them.
Really?
Yes, no stopping to pick up any wounded, really.
No.
It was very interesting to see the complete collapse of morale, which I had seen in 1940 on our own side.
Yes.
And of course the French were popping out and joining us, whereas in 1940 they were popping out and in many cases joining the Germans.
Yes.
Anything to save their lives.
Yes. Well, what I'd like to do this afternoon, sir, if I may, is take as our theme or our topic that of leadership, and perhaps discuss some of the attributes that you think our great commanders have had and perhaps should have. Now, it's always interested me to hear or to read that Frederick the Great believed that there was no such thing as a perfect general. Now, you knew many of the great wartime leaders, and I just wondered whether you knew the perfect general, or airman, if you like. Do you have any views on that?
Well, it's a very difficult question, isn't it? I think I agree with Frederick the Great.
Do you?
Yes. I think the British have a talent for pulling out of the muddle they always start everything in. Pulling the talent out required for particular situations. You see, we didn't start the war with Portal. He was pulled up quite soon after the war started. And Allenbrook, after the disaster in France, was put inside GIG, so you had a pair of people who turned out to be absolutely first class at the jobs. Monty was sent out to Alamein. Now, I'd never heard of him before, and I think a large number of other people hadn't heard of him, but he happened to be the chap that Portal picked out, Allenbrook picked out, because he knew him in France. So, the answer to your question is, it's no one's perfect, but you can make a pretty perfect team if you pick the sort of characters that have made a reputation in peacetime.
Now, there's clearly quite a difference, isn't there, between the sorts of attributes that you'd expect of commanders who are in the field and under fire, on the one hand, and the attributes of those who have to run whole armies and air forces. What do you feel is the major attribute, the most important attribute of some of the senior leader? I mean, is it cleverness in its widest sense?
I think one of the prime requirements is the ability to pick out the chaps to lead the various formations. In other words, to know a good chap when you see one. It's no good being frightfully clever and frightfully intelligent, etc., etc., if you don't get the right people in the other jobs. And I think that's very often lost sight of. it's essential to have that quality of picking out the sort of people you want to run, say, squadrons, stations, groups, commands, and so on. And I think Portal was behind a lot of this reform, so to speak.
Yes, you were talking earlier, weren't you, about the fact that when he came in, that there were quite a number of changes at the stations, at the squadron.
The ability to choose people and
so
promote them.
Mm.
I mean, the sort of promotions that went on couldn't possibly have happened in peacetime.
Mm.
So I think we were lucky. We had a man of great moral integrity and fighter command.
Mm.
We had Bert Harris, who, let's face it, had one of the most difficult jobs, sending people away to be killed over Berlin and so on. I mean, he had to have something that other people hadn't got. So, as I say, I think the British are very lucky in their ability to suddenly, in a crisis, pick somebody like Churchill.
Mm.
There wasn't a hope of Churchill being a Prime Minister until the war came, and then we happened to sort him out and use him, and if we'd used any of the others that were available, Chamberlain and so on, the whole thing would have been a disaster.
What about the quality of foresight, for example, of knowing and appreciating what needs to be done? I mean, in Dowding's case, for example, his intuition, if you like, that he did indeed have to maintain, safeguard his force in Britain rather than sending additional wings and squadrons to France, as he was so clearly pressurised to do.
Yes. Well, I don't know whether it was cleverness so much as the fact that he, well, like Monty, he was a professional. He'd studied. His life was devoted to studying the problems, as indeed Monty was. That doesn't necessarily make you popular in peacetime.
No.
And he was an academic. He foresaw the value of radar and how it could be improved and forced through developments and so on. Other people might have foreseen it, but they wouldn't have had the strength of character to force on with these sort of developments.
I mean, there do seem to have been one or two examples, don't there, of academic, I mean, you used that term, of academics getting to the senior positions, Monty, Dowding, Portal. Do you see that as significant, or were they just fairly isolated cases, do you think?
No, I think that they spent their lives, devoted their lives to looking at the problems. And they had the intuition, plus their experience, plus the picking of the people to take advice from the more junior ranks who were closer to the action, so to speak. Difficult to see. Dowding wasn't a great leader of men, but he was a great leader of fighter command. And he wasn't a good picker of men necessarily.
But again, he knew what needed to be done.
He knew what wanted to be done. He knew that he was going to stick it out and do it. Rather like Monty, sent out to Alamein, and there was Churchill pressing him, come on, get on with it, get cracking. And Monty refusing to be moved until he reckoned he was ready. Last thing he wanted was to have a disaster like the previous one.
Yes.
But he had the courage to know when he was ready to go. That requires a lot of courage when you're being pressed by a war cabinet, politicians wanting quick success, and the character of Churchill, himself a bully, a forceful character. It's not easy to stand up against people like that.
I always think it's interesting because, in a sense, people who climb the service tree get, I take it in many cases anyway, a reputation for physical courage in many instances. And yet when they get to the top of the tree, of course, it is indeed the moral courage that counts so much more, doesn't it? This ability to know when to say no, when to stick to one's guns and so forth.
Yes, because it's easier in the RAF, because when you're flying aeroplanes, which requires a certain amount of courage
Anyway, yes.
whereas a poor army chap driving a tank doesn't necessarily have to show any courage until it comes to war, and he needs probably a great deal more. It's easier for the Air Force to make a name for yourself either on the technical side, because we are a highly technical service as well, and on the operational side, because you can demonstrate your skill and courage in flying aeroplanes.
So you clearly feel that this reputation that people build up is actually quite an important feature for our more senior commanders, that they must have it to have the credibility to direct the troops subsequently.
Important. You see, I'd never heard of Dowding until he came to Fighter Command. Now, had he had a reputation of being, say, a fighter group commander, it made his job much easier.
Yes.
But he had no reputation. His reputation was in R&D. But you soon learnt the sort of character you've got over you. He might not be a great handler of men, but he certainly knew what he wanted, and he knew the problem.
So you feel people can actually succeed despite their not necessarily having a great reputation for being
Yes.
an expert pilot?
It depends on the problem. On the other hand, if you've got a chap in the front line, he must have a reputation for being able to do what he's asking the chaps to do.
Yes, quite. But of course, deciding what needs to be done is one thing, I suppose. Getting people to do it is quite another. And it certainly seems to me that different leaders do have evolved different ways of dominating others. And you in your career must have come across quite a number of very forceful characters. And I just wondered, how do you see this? How essential is it to have a totally dominating character? And indeed, can one have two dominating a character for the good of the outfit as a whole?
Yes. Well, one or two mistakes soon gets the dominating character thinking a bit more carefully about being dominating. He's preferable, I think, to a rather lily-livered chap who's waiting for somebody to tell him what to do. It's this mix. You asked about LM, the Mallory. He listened very much to the chaps he recognised as knowing what the fighting was all about. Douglas Bader was one particular influence.
Yes.
Too much of an influence, in my opinion. He dominated LM, whereas other people think LM was trying to dominate other people.
Yes.
And the reason was because Douglas Bader apparently knew more about the situation, the flying and the chaps and so on, than his AOC, who hadn't flown with them probably since the First World War. So it's an awful mix to try and come out with a solution. But certainly if you've got a reputation in peacetime, this is a great help when war starts. But equally, you've got to have a lot of foresight into which way the battle is going to go. If you haven't got that prepared in your mind, roughly in advance, then you could face up to most awful disasters.
And what about the power of examples? One gets drawn back into the examples of people like Victor Beamish, I think, who as a station commander was forever hopping in his aeroplane and going off to do things. I can understand that must have a tremendous effect on the men he commands, but is it in fact a very wise thing for a commander to do, to be forever leading from the front like that?
Well, I think so. I wouldn't know any other way to do it at that rank. But of course, when he was killed, he'd been taken off flying, and he was under LM at 11 Group. And his job was to fill in the gap that LM felt he there was between him and his junior commanders. So Beamish was constantly visiting the stations.
Mm.
If you wanted to get a chap a quick DFC or something, Beamish was a chap. He'd know the fella. He'd come around, he was meeting them and discussing the day's operations or the previous day. So he was a mind, apart from the fact he'd done it himself, commanding North Weald, he became the mind of the AOC in all these intimate bits of knowledge required as to whether you laid on a particular operation or did it this way or that way and so on and so forth. So he then, a particular station he was killed at, had an enormous reputation for high scores. And Beamish knew that we didn't think they could possibly be getting these scores. And having been a station commander, I'm sure he wondered. So he asked if he could go to that station and prove to himself. And in the process he was killed. Because he was trying to do what they said they were doing. And it was a shortcut to being shot down if you were too keen on shooting the enemy down and not looking after yourself at the same time, which you had to do. Otherwise the casualties would have shot him. So he wasn't setting an example. He was trying to find out what the difference with that wing was compared with the other wing. Because he knew them all. And then I took his place. I was taken off flying. And given the same job, roughly. So it's I mean I'm not all that courageous, but we got nasty jobs sometimes, like attacking a convoy. And the Germans had a habit of putting small convoys up the channel with a flak ship on each corner, 4 flak ships. So to get at them, you had to face the flak.
Whichever way you came in from.
Whatever you did, and a fighter pilot doesn't like facing flak, not his job. So we had to have a squadron on each flak ship, and then the top cover, and the bombers could then come in, not disturbed by flak, and sink the ships. This was before we had rocket typhoons. So occasionally I went on the anti-flak part of it, although I could choose which one I did. I felt I really hadn't got the nerve to put the chaps in on the anti-flak and take the top cover myself. So I did it occasionally, not for showing off, but because I felt I hadn't got the moral courage to tell somebody else to do it.
If you weren't prepared to do it yourself.
And avoid it myself. So I did it sufficiently to show that I would do it, and therefore they should do it.
But at what level then should one try to withdraw back from actual operations? I mean, did you feel? I mean, that Rommel, for example, has often been criticised for always being up front and therefore not really appreciating exactly what was going on across the whole of his front and the whole of his army. I mean, there is presumably some sort of dividing line where one does have to withdraw back into the headquarters and sit down and quietly think things through rather than being where the action is.
Yes. Well, yes. Well, I think he couldn't have led the army any other way.
Do you?
That was his nature, you see. Monty was always visiting the troops on the front line, but he never drove a tank or anything like that.
Right.
So he'd never had any fighting experience except in the First War. Whereas Rommel had led his troops in the front right from the beginning of the Second World War. In the process, one of my squadrons managed to get him in his staff car and shoot him into the dish. So, visiting the front line. But I think it's the temperament of the chap. Some people can put their personality over without actually taking part. Other people feel the need to lead from the front. And if you survive in doing it, of course, you become a fairly valuable fount of knowledge.
Quite, yes. So you don't think there are things that point to one direction being more successful than the other there?
I think it's up to your bosses. Lee Mallory was very much criticised. He lost Douglas Bader, he lost Tuck, he lost Beamish. I was shot up several times. Others were shot down. And the criticism began to arise. You were losing all this experience. And what are you gaining? So you had to start pulling people, the senior ones, off. Milan was stopped from flying, one of the best fighter pilots we had. So I think it's up to your boss to reckon, like a station commander, to recognise that that squadron commander is, if you leave him at it much longer, you're going to lose him, whereas you could use him as a wing commander. Or a wing commander flying as a station commander. Yes. So I think it's the job of the chap at the flying level to fly as much as he can. It's up to his boss to decide to preserve his value for other things. And this brings in one of the highest requirements of a commander, which is to be able to pick his chaps and utilise them to the best of their ability.
And what about coercion, sir? We were discussing example before, but are there also instances where people have relied on the Air Force Act and so on to get people to do things that they wouldn't particularly wish to do?
I don't think so. I think we had the yellow chit system, of course, but we took people off flying and put them on OCU training and this sort of thing. We never actually court-martialed them for refusing to do it. But there again, you depend on the ability of the next commander up to recognise this.
What is blatant cowardice and what is sort of shell shock and so forth.
But it's no good using the Air Force Act. The thing is, it's shame enough to chuck him out of his job, put him somewhere else. No, I don't think we had it, and the same with the airmen. I mean, you had airmen running away under bombing, but I don't know a case of anybody court-martialing them for doing
as a result of it. No, that's interesting.
But they all know that the Air Force Act is there in the final analysis. The commander could use it.
It's a good backstop, isn't it?
It's a good backstop. You have to have it. In war.
Yes. And how much of a commander's effectiveness rests on bluff or dissimulation, if you like? Do you feel that's much of a factor?
I think those people have found out too quickly. Particularly in what you might call in a flying setup war, they soon recognise, to use a common Air Force expression, bullshit when they see it.
Yes. On the other hand, a lot of major senior commanders have been good actors too, though, haven't they? In the sense that putting on the act is also part of the way that one can actually improve morale or whatever. I mean, one thinks of Monty's double beret, cap badges and so forth.
Yes, he is.
Did you think acting is part of the job then?
No, I think he wanted to identify himself with the troops who were killed in thousands. He used to take me up to the front line with him, which I hated.
Really?
No, he'd go up in a jeep with bloody bullets flying around the place, and he'd talk to a corporal in a slit trench or behind a pile of sand. He'd talk to him. What's your name? Charlie Snooks or something, you see. His ADC would write it all down. And then in the evening, after dinner, he would go to his caravan and write to dear Mrs. Snooks in Reading or somewhere.
I have today spoken to your husband and he's in good heart. And
Charlie, he's doing a tremendous job and could be promoted and so on. This went airmail. No censorship or anything. Went straight back. Well, you would imagine that arriving and the old mum saying, oh, well, I've just heard from General Montgomery. Oh, Charlie's. Then she'd write to Charlie, who would eventually get the letter to find that the general had actually written to his mother or father.
Yes.
And he didn't give it to his ADC to do. He wrote it in his own handwriting, signed B.L. Montgomery, General. See?
Yes.
Well, that was all to get the troops behind him. I don't think he was showing himself off. This was all part of the business of making people get themselves killed, if you like to put it crudely.
Yes.
And, of course, the spirit of the 8th Army was terrific, as indeed it was of the Desert Air Force, because Again, it's fairly simple to do it in an isolated situation. They hadn't got their families to go to. They bombed out houses in London all of a sudden. They were in the desert. There was nothing there, no other attraction, no cinemas, no girlfriends, nothing. Get them into Malta and see what they did.
That was rather different, was it?
I remember the governor ringing me up and saying, "Are these Australians yours?" They'd been up and down the desert for about 3 years. I said, "Well, they're not mine. I happen to command them." He said, "Well, you better do something about them. There won't be a virgin left on this island." So, you see, the spirit of the chaps, terrific. Now, having them out in the desert, they didn't get into this sort of mischief, as they did in Europe and Italy and Sicily and so on.
And which, in fact, was the easier situation for the commander then?
Oh, the desert.
Without the distractions.
Yes, no distractions.
Right.
A bit of leave back in Cairo or Alexandria.
Periodically, just to recharge batteries and so on.
That's right. And, but that's all. So you became part of the community, all devoted to the same thing.
Yes.
And this is where Monty was the great leader.
Yes, quite.
Now, in Europe, that didn't happen quite the same way, particularly in places like Brussels and Paris.
Yeah, so that sort of communicating skill between the commander and his troops is obviously a very critical and crucial issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
And who was the best at that? I mean, Monty himself, do you think?
Well, I wasn't in the Far East. Certainly, I never saw anybody approach Monty's ability to have the troops, except somebody like Churchill.
Yes.
In the Air Force, of course, it wasn't as necessary, because the fighting element is such a small proportion of the whole.
So a commander could actually meet most of his aviators, most of the aircraft. Yes, I see. What about the sort of stresses that the senior commanders are under? I mean, I can well imagine that it is stressful being responsible for whole armies and operations going wrong. Were there any? I mean, were there any that failed miserably, that couldn't take the stress that you were aware of?
At the beginning.
Yes.
When all the odds are against them anyway. At the beginning. But, well, at the end of the Europe campaign, to give an example, I'm probably weaker than most, but LM asked me to go to the Far East with him. And I liked LM, and I said to him, "Look, I don't want to really go out to the Far East and start all over again. I've had 5 years on the telephone." From squadron leader upwards, we'd been at readiness doing something.
Yes.
And I wasn't feeling very well, and I said, "I'm sorry." Now, of course, there's a bit of luck, because
he was killed on the way out, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
I could have been in the aeroplane with him, so there are odd bits of luck around. But I think I would have had difficulty in starting all over again in a new part of the world with new chaps and new commanders, and different army and so on. So it's quite hard work.
Yes.
In wartime.
In wartime. And what about the less martial attributes, sir, if I can tax you on that? I mean, things like clarity of thought and ability to articulate one's ideas and so forth. I mean, that also seems to me to be quite an important aspect for a senior commander. I mean, who, in your experience, shone most at that?
Well, I think Portal must have been very good at it on the Chiefs of Staff. Because during his time, he and Brooke made a perfect pair, I think. And of course, you've got to get your point of view across, particularly to the other services and to the politicians particularly. I think the ability to manoeuvre politically is an essential part of a top commander's job. Rather like Churchill, sold himself on the radio to keep the support of the civilian population. Of course, now with television, this sort of thing going on, it makes it very difficult, because the thing's brought right into your family can actually see what's happening. I think this wrecked the Americans in Vietnam.
Yes.
Because with all due respect to the television people, and the radio people, they don't necessarily put the right story over. They're looking for sensation.
Yes.
And so I think putting your story across is an absolute essential part of a commander's job. And you've got to be very careful when you're surrounded by all the media, as you will be in the next war, if there is one.
Yes. So in a sense you think it's far more difficult now than perhaps it was 40 years ago?
Oh yes, I'm quite sure.
Yes. And what about the other, the sort of personal virtues, if you like, you know, honour, sincerity, concern for others, and even a sense of humour and charm? I mean, to what extent do you think those are vital for a senior commander?
Well, a chap with a personality is off to a good start. But integrity, I would put...
You put that number one, would you?
Number one, yeah. Absolutely.
But from what point of view? From the point of view of the commander's credibility to those underneath him, or from the point of view of consistency with his peers and seniors?
Well, I think you've got to be seen to know what you're talking about. The chaps who you're asking to do the fighting have got to believe that you know what you're trying to make them do. And the people above you have got to believe that doing it this way is better than doing it that way. It's not easy, but you soon get a reputation for integrity. In other words, even though you may be wrong, at least you were sticking up for a principle or a point of view.
And you'll admit to it later as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yes. It's yes, very important.
And what about things like a sense of humour? Do you think that counts for very much? I mean, quite a number of the senior men in the last war appear not to have a great deal of sense of humour, and yet still succeeded.
Yes. On the other hand, Churchill had. I think if you're in close contact with people like fighter pilots, you've got to have a sense of humour. You've got to have a personality of some sort to get across. But as you say, the people at the top like doubting. I mean,
with that famous nickname Stuffy too.
Stuffy, I don't think he had a sense of humour. Monty had a very minor sense of humour. The whole thing was dead serious as far as he was concerned. But some of his generals had. He didn't know they had, but they had.
And that rather made up for his own lack of it, you mean?
That's right.
Yes.
I knew them when they weren't with him. When they were with him, they were terribly
straight-laced as anybody else.
Absolutely, yeah. One word out of place and they've got a thick ear. But on their own, with their own divisions and so on.
Yeah, so you think to that extent the qualities in one man can easily counteract the lack somewhere else.
He tends to pick the people that make up his own lack of whatever it is. If you can't do that, so I say picking your staff, picking the people under you, is an absolute essential to a top commander. Because he will tend to pick the people who've got the qualities he hasn't got.
So it's quite essential to get that sort of complementary view, is what you're saying?
I think so, yes. That's my experience. Anyway.
Yes. And just going back to this attribute of integrity that we were talking about before, I mean, there were examples, I think, weren't there, in the last war, of people, of senior commanders actually failing to live up to these high standards. Is there anything you'd like to say on that, in that area, without necessarily naming names?
No, I wouldn't want to discuss any particular people.
But in terms of effects on subordinates and so forth?
Well, the job became much more difficult when you had the Americans gradually assuming dominance. This is where Monty failed utterly. He thought they were a bunch of bloody amateurs. They thought he was a bossy so-and-so, you see. So he started to fail at the peak of his career, so to speak, in that he simply couldn't get on with Americans. He didn't like them. And the situation's more confused because Tedder, who was deputy to Eisenhower, sided with the Americans. So you had this sort of constant harping of the Air Force top brass against the Army top brass, which had not been helped by Cunningham, which I told you about in this press conference. It was a pity, really, because I don't think they could have moved Monty, because the public was so much behind him, and the troops. I think the morale effect of sacking him because
would have been catastrophic.
Would have been catastrophic.
Yes.
He got the loyalty of these chaps, and he took them into his confidence. He would go around and say, "Now this is what we're going to do. This is the battle we're going to fight. This is why we're doing it this way or that way." And the troops had never been taught like that before. They just normally did as they were told. Now there was this great chap coming around talking to them and telling them what he wanted to achieve and why he wanted to achieve it. I mean, when at Alamein, I was absolutely horrified to drive up through the battlefield and see the casualties. I hadn't seen it in France. The simple reason we were retreating. Once you started to advance, it didn't take me long to be sympathetic with the Army, and thank God I joined the Air Force, so to speak. But to get chaps to do that, you've got to have something. And I would say the same, running a bomber setup. To send chaps off, as indeed, say, the Yanks did in their daylight raids, getting a 20% loss every time.
Yes, that's true.
How do you keep chaps going at it? Of course, it's the morale of the whole service in the case of the Air Force. You can't do that in the Army because they've got 1 million to our sort of 500,000, so to speak, or 200,000 in numbers. Only a small number of whom are actually fighting, whereas in the Army they're virtually all fighting.
Yes.
A ship is much easier because you can build up the morale of a ship's company. And you go into attack, the captain's there, everybody's there. If they're going to get sunk, they all get sunk. So again, in the Navy, probably the easiest of the lot, if you're a good commander, and they can see your seamanship and your successes. You sink a submarine or you shoot another destroyer up or something, and you start getting a reputation of being not only good, but lucky. The day you get the bad luck, they don't remember that.
I was going to say. I mean, the reverse, of course, is that it's that. But if the commander is not actually terribly good, it's that much worse aboard a Navy ship, presumably, than it is, say, in an Army regiment or RAF Squadrons.
Well, it's you're asking some very difficult questions.
So we've ranged fairly far and wide, I think, over the various attributes of our senior commanders. And I just wondered whether, in a nutshell, you'd care to comment as to whether commanders are born or made, or is it really a question of both?
Well, you've got to be born, haven't you? I think you're
born to be a commander, should I say?
I think you're born with something. And then the service make up the rest. If they've got the right material. I think the way, particularly the Air Force is run, I'm talking about the GD side of it, I think that the attributes you're born with are developed by the service. A bit like the Navy, you love the sea, you want to go to sea. In the Air Force, you want to fly, that's why you come in. You don't come in because you don't want to fly or to get the money. I mean, it's a shortcut to bankruptcy, isn't it? So then taking along the technical people with you in war, this is a much easier problem, but nevertheless still an essential problem. Maintenance and so on, and supplies being brought up probably under bombing, and you've still got to have a pretty high morale in the whole Air Force. But it's easier because it's smaller, the problem's smaller. I don't know. Some people can do it, some people can't do it. Some people you will never make a commander of them. And other chaps shine out right from school.
And I suppose the epitome there still has to be Churchill, doesn't it?
Yes. I used to fly him around the wings in this Storch. And the effect on the troops was out of this world. I mean, airmen,
Yes.
talking about the soldiers, he'd get up on a chair or a table or something and
hold forth.
And hold forth, a lot of it top secret. And the troops cheering their heads off.
Yes. And what about the famous story you mentioned to me the other day of Churchill at Remagen Bridge, when I think you brought him in?
It wasn't Remagen, it was a Bailey Bridge.
It was a Bailey Bridge, was it?
Yes. I flew him up. Monty, as usual, was right up in the front line, his TAC headquarters. And he was on the banks of the river, this Bailey Bridge, with the troops flowing over the last stages of the war. We'd already dropped them. Parachutists over there.
Over the Rhine.
Over the Rhine. And I arrived at Churchill and had a picnic lunch because the troops could see him. As soon as they recognised him, the whole place was cheering his head off, you see. Then he got up and with one of his huge cigars, he waddled across to the bridge, this Bailey Bridge, undoing his flies as he went. And then peed into the Rhine. The troops were quick enough off the mark to see what the gesture meant.